Good afternoon, Doc. Good afternoon, everyone. I am tasked right now to report the roles of assessment in making instructional decision. So this would be our fourth, fifth, and sixth week of presentation that we also have to comply in our subject. So let me start my report by introducing the title of the rules of assessment. So according to Brown of 2018, assessment enhances learning in the instructional process if the result provides feedback to both students and teacher. And according to Brown, the information obtained from the assessment is used to evaluate the teaching methodologies and strategies of the teacher. So when we talk about assessment, it talks about how teachers should make sure that they were able to determine themselves and their capabilities in order to deliver good information to their students. It's one way for us as educators to provide feedback to our students because it's really essential that in providing feedback to them, students will be able to learn from what they're able to learn from their teachers. Second is, Brown also emphasized that it also used to make teaching decision, and at the same time, the result of assessment is used to diagnose the learning problems of the student. So as teachers, we really have to have capabilities in making decisions as to what should be done to our students in such a way that they will be able to learn and at the same time they will be able to get something from us based on our discussions and and classes. It's also very important that as teachers, we will be able to diagnose our students to know what particular objectives and goals needed in order for these diagnoses to be achieved. And we could also incorporate evaluation at the same time because right after these goals and objectives are being intervened, evaluation will then take place. According to Brown, teacher must number one, pre-instruction or prior knowledge, number two, during instruction or student's progress, and number three, post-instruction assessment or the mastery. So we will gonna tackle this one by one. So let's talk about pre-instruction. According to Brown of 2018, this provides information about the lacking competencies such as knowledge and skill. As teachers, we have to consider the assessment needed prior to starting a certain discussion to students. It's very important that as teachers, we have to know the knowledge and the skills of our students in such a way that we have to do pre-testing. With that, with that kind of strategy and skill of a teacher, this could somehow improve what specific lessons to be delivered, what specific lessons that our students should learn, and lessons in which students will be able to apply in their practical lives. The second one is during the instruction. That's also with Brown of 2018. So we have to monitor students' learning. In this particular phase, we also have to set teaching at the level that challenges students' metacognitive skills or high level thinking. It's very important that as teachers, we will be able to challenge the thinking and cognitive skills of our students. At the very beginning of every lesson, there should be assessment, and with that kind of assessment, we will be able to monitor what our students are learning. And this would also help as teachers and have us some guide as to what particular direction should we go into with the specific targets and goals for the class. The second is post-assessment. That's the last one according to Brown of 2018. So we have to monitor whether the learner were able to master the basic contents, the knowledge and skills required from the learner's activity. Post-assessment would include certain examinations, things that you're going to ask to your student right after the discussion, things that would challenge them as to what were their thinking and what were their thoughts during the discussion. It's very important that this also been incorporated to assessment that we also have to have evaluation. And why do we need to evaluate? So according to Shepard of 2006, there are five ways in order for us to provide evaluation because these are essentials. No? So number one, we have to determine the student's entry behavior. Number two, to determine the objectives has been attained or not attained. Number three, to determine students' strengths and weaknesses. Number four, to rate the student's performance for the purpose of giving grades. And number five, to improve teaching learning process. So these particular ways as to how can we evaluate based on Shepherd of 2006 guidelines, it's very important that every students are being evaluated. The particular reason why we need to have assessment is that we need to also engage with evaluation to our students. Without assessment, there will be no evaluation. And if there is evaluation, we could always do reassessment and we need to go back to the same cycle or to the same process where it was started. So this is a model in which Shepard 2006 was able to develop. So evaluation is used to determine. And these were used with placement, diagnostic, formative, and summative. Now let me just dig in a very succinct definition of what these fours all about. So when you say placement, that's what questions such as what the students or what they already know, what are the things that these students were already know. And if you're going to talk about diagnostics, you're going to talk about students' weakness for remedial instruction. When you say formative, if instructional objectives are being achieved or not achieved. And when you say summative, if the student master the objectives for the purpose of giving grades. Okay? So the four roles of assessment used in instructional process, this is according to NITCO of 2001. So we have the placement role, that's the first role. And according to NITCO of 2001, the purpose of placement assessment is to determine the prerequisite skills, degree of mastery of the course, and the best mode of learning. And he also added up that is being used to determine the entry behavior of the pupils, students, or even learners. And he also informed that the use of placement rule is to determine the performance at the beginning of instruction. So what is the goal of NITCO as what he emphasized? This is to determine the position in instructional sequence and the mode of evaluation. So that means to say that as teachers, we have to make sure that instructional sequence are being properly in place in such a way that we will be able to come up with a very good evaluation as one mode of the delivery of the specific lesson for our students. Placement from its term place. When you say placement, that means to say that you have to make sure that everything is being organized, everything is in place, and everything should be properly planned prior to doing certain tasks when you advance to the next step. The next one is formative role. So according to NITCO, formative assessment is a type of assessment used to monitor the learning progress of students during instruction. And the main purpose of formative assessment is being classified into four. The first is continuous feedback. The second is identify learning errors. The third is modifying instruction. And the fourth improves both learning and instruction. So formative role as well is also being used as a type of assessment during the instruction. So this is the time that we are trying to deliver the instruction to the students. And at the same time, formative role helps detect which students need attention. When you say formative role, from the word itself, formative, that means to say that everything is in format. And there is a specific format that you have to follow in order for you to be guided. Would either be some checklists, or would even be some sequence of activities that are being in place, or even the rubrics are very important in terms of providing our role in assessing our students. Now there are actually types of formative assessment according to NITCO of 2001. First is observation during in-class activities of students' nonverbal feedback during lecture. So this is the time that we are doing lecture in such a way that we teachers are always been the captain of the ship in terms of delivering the lessons to them. And with that, there is no verbal interaction between the students because the students are learning or listening from you. The second is reflections journal that are reviewed periodically during the semester. So it's very important that students would always keep a certain journal or a certain portfolio in such a way that it's being reviewed by their teachers periodically, quarterly, or even at the end of semester, so that everything is being complied and everything is being done by the students and to know the progress of the student. The third one is homework exercises as reviewed for exams and class discussion. It's very important that we have to give homework to our students, but right now in this 21st century, students are able to learn on their own. However, we don't have to underestimate homeworks because homeworks are also very important in such a way that we teach our students to learn independently. And question and answer session, both formal, planned, and informal, spontaneous. So formative assessment would always use question and answer portion at the very beginning, during the discussion, and at the end of the discussion. So it's very important that we have to activate the brain cells of our students so that they'll be challenged as to what things that's in their mind, and we have to question them just to assess and check their knowledge. Another very important type are conferences between instructor and students. Various points in the semester, it's very important that we could have groups or even conferences that not just one student that we are talking into, but we're talking as a group, because this would lead to support, and at the same time, this would foster a camaraderie between students as to how they were properly being assessed and evaluated. The next type is students' feedback collected by periodically answering specific questions about the instruction and their self-evaluation of performance and progress. It doesn't mean that we have to take this one at the end of every lesson, but it's very important that from time to time we have to evaluate, re-evaluate, and do evaluation at all times for our students to know if they were able to still get the lessons that we are teaching to them. And lastly, in class activities where students informally present their result. So not all the time is scripted. Sometimes there should be spontaneity. Students should be challenged as to the dynamic way of learning, especially in this 21st century, that everything that we are doing right now is really changing and it's dynamic, it's keep on changing. And we just not have to settle for just a specific way of handling a formal lesson, but in such a way that students will be able to have their creativity and show their artful skills to the class. The next role is diagnostic role. No? So this is used to diagnose students' learning difficulties during instruction. That's according to NITCO of 2001, to determine the specific learning needs of the student and strengths and weaknesses. So diagnostic role. So with the term diagnostic, you're going to diagnose. You're going to determine what is really the root cause as to why the student should learn, the things as to why you're doing this and that. With the proper diagnosis of the roles, where the proper diagnosis for our students, this would somehow entail a very good way of assessing our students. We will be able to know what things that they wanted to learn, the things that they wanted to do, and all things that they wanted to do and learn as well together. So it's not just independently done by the teacher, but it should be collaborative way between teachers and students in such a way that students will be able to learn from their teachers and teachers will be able to learn from their students. So there are types of diagnostic assessment as well, okay? That's according to NITCO of 2001. First is you have to do pre-testing. So it's very important that pre-tests are being given so that we will be able to determine if our students knows the lesson or which particular lesson should we focus into with a discussion. So this is the content and abilities. Okay. Next is self-assessment. There should be a certain activity in which students will be able to identify skills and competencies in such a way that they will be able to determine themselves that there are having deficiency of such. Next is discussion board response on content and specific prompts. And of course, we could also do interviews. So these are brief interviews, which would take 10 to 20 minutes interview of each student. No? However, this would be time consuming, but doing interviews is very important because it's one way for the students to express themselves. And last role that we will be tackling with is summative role. So NITCO of 2001 again defined summative assessment as a type of assessment usually given at the end of course unit. The purpose of summative assessment would suffice three different determinants. So first is instructional objectives are being achieved, certify the student's mastery, and provide information for judging. It's also one way for us to determine that through summative role, its effectiveness of the instruction. This also identify or determine the mastery at the end of the course and the overall assessment if it's being achieved at the end or being used to primarily for assigned course grade. So with its term summative, that means to say that you're doing a summary. When we're doing a summary, everything comprises the things that we are able to incorporate in our lessons. It's very important that we know its effectivity, the efficiency, the practicality, and how it's being applied to our personal, mental, physical, emotional, and all the following um, information that is being provided. Next, the type of summative assessment according to NITCO 2001. First is examination. Of course, most of the schools are doing this one. They are trying to give examination at the end of every class or at the end of every quarter. There are certain major exams and high stakes exams. Next, yes, final examination, which is truly a summative assessment. It could be given into number of certain topics or questions, probably around 50 to 100 points on that particular examination. Term papers, this is considered as drafts submitted throughout the semester in such a way that it's a formative assessment. And projects could be a form of summative assessment because project phases are being complied in such ways that points should be taken and could be formatively done through assessment. Another type of assessment are portfolios, no? Portfolios that are being complied at the end of every semester or every quarter or every end of the year and could also be used in assessing during its development as a formative assessment. Performances of the students are also not taken for granted. We have to check if the performance of the students are being evaluated, if these skills, knowledge, and even behaviors and attitude were met or not met, or goals were met or not met. Student evaluation of the course. So this is teaching effectiveness. So it's a one way for us to make sure that students are given evaluation, providing what things that they need to learn more or things that they need to be adjusted, things that they wanted to add up more in their vocabularies. And lastly, it's the instructor self-evaluation. It's also very important that as an instructor, we will be able to identify our own capabilities and skills as well. There are times that we have to determine our strengths and weaknesses because it's one way for us to determine if we're doing it right or if we were able to still be aligned of what the institution is going towards. Summative assessment is also being utilized in making judgment in teaching process and interview results. So, according to Borich of 2004, to ensure that teacher's summative assessment gives valid and reliable account of student learning, systems of summative assessment must include robust and permanent procedures of moderation of teacher's judgment. And Borich also added that understanding of criteria would certainly help by involving teacher as far as possible in their development. So this is also one way for us to enhance our judgment. As teachers, that's a very important skill because it could be utilized in the teaching process and interview results. So if we're going to have a comparison between formative and summative assessment, according to National Research Council of 2001 and American Psychological Association of 2001, a formative versus a summative, if we're going to tackle formative first, this will include students are given the opportunity to improve their performance on the same tasks. And students expect feedback on their performance, enabling them to improve their performance on the same task. And although diagnostic is in nature, the student's knowledge of their strengths and weaknesses is categorized as formative. On the other way around, if we're going to talk into summative, it's more into the outcome of the task can neither be repeated nor even improved. And at the same time, a final grade is being released on the assessment task. And lastly, assessment is done at the end of systematic and incremental learning activities that have formative assessment tasks. So if we're going to synthesize these two for formative and summative, those are actually still very important in the role of assessment because without one role present in the roles of assessment, tendency is we will not be able to achieve our goals and objectives. These roles are very important and these roles are essential to the learning of our students. So we will be talking about the instructional design that would talk again summative, placement, formative, and diagnostic. No? So the use in instructional design according to Miller of 2013. So let's tackle placement. Okay, so what is the function of assessment? So when you say placement, utilized in the instructional design, it's an assessment procedure used to determine the learner's prerequisite skills, degree of mastery of the course goals, and or best modes of learning. Let me just talk some examples of the instruments that are being utilized. First, for placement, there should be readiness tests. There are exams that we have to have it ready. We have to make sure that everything is in plan. It's good that we always practice spontaneity, but it would be best that everything would be organized prior to meeting your student to know the readiness. Next is the aptitude tests. These are tests that are given in schools, no, to determine the knowledge of the students. Pre-tests on course objectives are very important, as what I mentioned in the previous slide. Self-report inventories and observational techniques are some of the examples for placement. Next, the use of instructional design according to Miller when we're talking about formative. So the function of assessment is assessment procedure used to determine the learner's learning progress, provides feedback to reinforce learning, and correct learning errors. A very good example for formative, if we're going to apply it in the instructional design, is the teacher-made tests. Most of us are doing it in our own because we are the ones who know the capabilities of our student that in the very beginning of the class you are doing a diagnosis and at the same time doing pre-testing. Another very good example for formative is custom-made tests from textbook publishers. Most of us are anchoring it to evidence-based published works or journals, and even books are very important and essential in such a way that we will be able to get lessons coming from there based on what we are giving to our students as part of their exams. And last is observational technique. No? It's very important that we could also incorporate exam questions related to the different technique as to how students were able to learn. This is very applicable to related learning experience. It's because you are observing what the students are doing, and with that, you will be able to test their knowledge to check if what they're doing is the ideal one or just in the practical level. The next use of instructional design according to Miller is diagnostic. So function of assessment for diagnostic, it's more into the procedure used to determine the causes of learners' persistent learning difficulties, such as intellectual, physical, emotional, and environmental difficulties. So to name some of the examples of instruments, are first is published diagnostic tests. So these are anchored with evidence-based published materials. Teacher-made diagnostic tests in which you alone will be able to do it on your own in the diagnosis. And observational technique, same as what we've mentioned in the previous slide. And the last one is the summative, which is used in instructional design according to Miller 2013. Its function of assessment is a procedure used to determine the end of course achievement for assigning grades or certifying mastery of objective. So a very good example of instruments are teacher-made survey tests, performance rating scale. Performance rating scale, just to give a very good example, is to do return demonstration. It's one way for us to evaluate if our students were able to perform all the essential items included, the important things that they have to perform in front of a clinical instructor or even um, a teacher, and product skills. So, American Educational Research Association of 2014 was able to mention about the norm and criterion reference interpretations. And when you say norm reference interpretation, this is used to describe students' performance according to the relative position in some known group. In this method of interpretation, it is assumed that the level of performance of student will not vary much from one class to another. So that means to say that we couldn't conclude that one class will be the same as the other class. Every class is different and they are unique from each other and they have different ways of learning. However, we could incorporate environment in terms of the criterion because it plays a very essential role for the students to learn. The environment we don't know from the different class is totally different from the other one. The other one excelled, but the other one didn't. So that plays a very good role in terms of the reference interpretation. According to American Educational Research Association 2014, norm reference evaluation is used in the following cases. So number one, for subject matter that is not cumulative and students do not need to reach some specified level of competency. The second one is for selection purpose if the instruction is constrained of enrollment. And number three, for predicting degrees of success. The second norm and criterion reference interpretation according to American Educational Research Association of 2014 is the criterion reference interpretation. So in this interpretation, it is used to describe students' performance according to specified domain or clearly defined learning tasks. This method of interpretation is used when the teacher wants to determine how well the students have learned specific knowledge or skills in a certain course or subject matter. So when there is this kind of interpretation being adopted in the academe or in the educational field, this means to say that as teachers, we have to make sure if our students were able to learn knowledge and skills. It's very important that we have to consider the learning capabilities, the resources, the materials, the different factors which influence the students' learning capabilities in such a way that we have to base it with a certain criteria, reference, and being interpreted. And methods of interpreting results according to Kubizin of 2012. So, type of assessment, criterion reference. So, the function of assessment, it is used to describe students' performance according to a specified domain of clear defined learning tasks. And this, a very good example is multiples. Another example of instrument for criterion reference is readiness test, aptitude test, pre-test on course, objectives, self-report inventories, and observational techniques. No? The method of interpreting results according to Kubicin 2012 is norm reference. So when you say norm reference, its function is used to describe students' performance according to relative position in some known group. Say for example, student ranks fifth in a classroom which is a group of 40. No? Examples of instruments that are used, standard and aptitude, and achievement test. You also have teacher-made survey test, interest inventory, and adjustment inventory. So, norm reference assessment versus criterion reference assessment. This is according to American Educational Research Association of 2014. So when you say norm reference assessment, this covers a very large domain of learning tasks. It emphasizes discrimination among individuals in terms of relative levels of learning, and of course, it favors items of average difficulty and usually omits easy items. Non-reference assessment used primarily but not exclusively for survey testing, and interpretation requires a clear defined group. Whereas to criterion reference assessment, it tackles more into the larger domain of learning tasks. It even emphasizes discrimination among individuals in level of relative learning levels of learning, favors item of average difficulty and usually omits easy item, used primarily but not exclusively for survey testing, and interpretation requires a clear defined group. And other purpose of evaluation according to Shepard of 2006. This is used to determine the effectiveness of the teacher method. Number two, it used to give meaning to students' effort in their quest for quality learning. Number three, used to justify the request and utilization of supplies, materials, equipment of school operation. Number four, used to plan for and improve the next educational activity. Number five, used to give recognition and award to best performing individual. And evaluation also used to promote quality assurance within and outside of the school. So just to give a summary about how evaluation would greatly impact the role of assessment, and at the same time both would always come together, is that evaluation would always represent the effectivity and efficiency of how teachers are doing. It's also very important that students will be able to understand and they'll be able to come up to a realization that what they are doing is for quality learning. And evaluation as well is more into the different things that are needed in order for it to be done. And at the same time, with regards to evaluation, it's one way for us to boost the morale of the students because evaluation could always be used to provide awards and to recognize a student, learner, or even a student or learner who was able to do good in school. Okay? And to sum up and to give synthesis of my report, assessment and evaluation are essential in terms of providing proper education to our students. These two would always come together and they won't they won't they would always come together and at the same time they won't be separated. We couldn't achieve evaluation if there is no assessment and there is no assessment if there is no evaluation being done. As educators, we have to consider that in everything that we do, it always starts with assessment and would always end up with evaluation. And if everything doesn't work, then we have to go back from the very beginning. But if in terms of things would work, we have to make sure that it should be steady and it should be consistent at all times. After all, what we're providing with our students is quality education. And I think that ends my report. And right now, I'm projecting the references in APA, the latest edition, which is the seventh edition, in alphabetical order. So thank you for listening and have a great day. Thank you, Doc.